Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Last month, we had announced sort of the first suite of grants from the coronavirus relief funds to support families, small businesses, nonprofits, and health services impacted by COVID-19. The nine programs provide an array of support, such as helping small businesses to retain current employees or business viability, helping food and ag businesses to bolster food security, providing housing assistance for Montanans, assisting our nonprofits with retaining existing programs and support, supporting local public health departments in their work to contact and trace and prepare businesses to safely reopen. And last week, we added the Montana Business Adaptation Program to provide reimbursement for COVID-19 expenses related to keeping employees and customers safe. Montana's workers, businesses, and economic sectors have been financially impacted by this emergency and certainly need assistance now. That's exactly what we're aiming to do as we continue to deploy the dollars appropriated to Montana from the CARES Act. New to the covidrelief.mt.gov website, there's a dynamic dashboard that you can click on that shows the grants that have been paid to businesses and nonprofits. Dollars are going out the door and to dang near every county in our state. At the same time, our state agencies are working diligently to be careful stewards of taxpayer dollars and ensure that the Montanans and businesses receiving this funding actually meet the eligibility requirements. More than 8,000 Montana businesses have applied for funding through the Business Stabilization Program, and more than $10 million has already gone out the door to Montana businesses that need it. And we're already getting reports that this funding is indeed making a difference. A coffee shop owner in Gaudin County said that the application process for the Business Stabilization Program was thorough but doable, and was grateful for the money to help get through this challenging time. Or a jewelry maker in Northwest Montana said that as a small business owner, she was used to going it alone, but that getting a grant will help her business survive. A magazine publisher said that this funding has made a huge impact on the likelihood that their business will survive, and that they are actually looking forward to providing detailed reporting on how they use this grant to continue operations during the financial headwinds of COVID-19. With such a high demand of applicants from the Business Stabilization Program, we've decided to add an additional $25 million, bringing the total funding available to $75 million. These dollars will ensure that even more Montana-based small businesses with 50 or fewer employees that have sustained a loss of revenue due to COVID-19 are able to keep their businesses running and indeed moving forward. Through the agriculture adaptability grants, the projects we've seen so far have really shown Montana producers' willingness to diversify and adapt in ways that strengthen our local distribution channels. From expansions that include farm stands to new digital sales platforms, Montanans are balancing tradition with new age infrastructure to find better ways of doing business. Our ag producers are certainly no strangers to meeting challenges. And despite the trying times that this pandemic has posed, farmers and ranchers are pressing on, and they're doing so with the innovation that is building a stronger foundation for the future. We want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to see to it that there are viable markets. The Agriculture Adaptability Program is here to provide relief to small and medium-sized food and ag businesses across our state in response to the increased demands on local food systems. We've added an additional $250,000 to that program to ensure that we're meeting the demand of our producers. Additionally, today I'm announcing the Montana Meat Processing Infrastructure Grant, which is available starting immediately to aid small and medium-sized meat processors responding to COVID-19 supply disruptions. These grants will support local meat processing infrastructure and capacity within our state. Due to interruptions in national supply chains, meat processing capacity throughout the country has been significantly impacted. Supporting in-state meat processing infrastructure and capacity will provide alternative market channels for Montana's cattle, hog, and poultry producers. Examples of eligible expenses under this new grant program include equipment and infrastructure that increases processing or storage capacity, costs associated with becoming state or federally inspected, and other adaptation or diversification activities. The maximum award meat processors can receive is $150,000. We're making available a total of up to $2 million for the program. Our ranchers certainly raise some of the world's best beef, and there's no shortage here in Montana. But right now, the majority of our livestock production depends on national and international markets. These grants will help boost processing and storage capacity. They'll help Montana businesses put more Montana meat onto more shelves. And an increase in in-state processing means more direct sales and better value-added markets for producers. Plus, consumers benefit from having a secure supply of locally produced and processed food. Investments will bolster Montana's food security, making it stronger in response to the pandemic as well as long into the future. Now, when I'd put together the Coronavirus Relief Fund Advisory Council, it was a couple of weeks before the state received the $1.25 billion in federal CARES Act dollars. I asked the members of that council to consider the needs of all sectors of our economy, of each region of the state, and to strive for both short-term and long-term recovery. The recommendations of the council and from the public comment that we received from Montanans are being followed closely by our administration. Our priorities and the priorities of the Advisory Council have been to make sure that the dollars are going to those who most need it, those who keep our main streets thriving, those who make up our workforce and keep our industries running, and those who serve our communities to ensure that services remain intact for Montanans during the pandemic. It's also a priority that Montanans in all corners of the state have an equal shot at receiving funds if they do meet the requirements. Along with Montanans, our local governments have gone to great lengths throughout our response to COVID-19 to keep their local communities safe. And that's also come with an extra cost. So today I'm also announcing that we'll be making available reimbursements for local governments related to COVID-19 expenditures. Using CARES Act dollars, both county and city and town governments can submit requests for reimbursement for items like medical expenses, public health expenses, or employees' regular and overtime hours substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19. Furthermore, through the FEMA Public Assistance Grant Program, local governments can be eligible for reimbursement for costs related to emergency protective measures, such as a result of COVID-19, such as emergency operations center activities, training, facility disinfection, technical assistance, and more. This reimbursement process will be administered by the Department of Administration in consultation with the Budget Office and the Department of Military Affairs. I'm certainly pleased that we've been able to build on our long-standing established working relationships with the Montana Association of Counties and the Montana League of Cities and Towns, and our existing partnerships with county commissioners, mayors, and other local officials across Montana to respond with a unified front in the face of the pandemic. As we strive toward short and long-term economic recovery for our neighbors all throughout the state, we'll continue to monitor the dollars currently going out the door, continue to make decisions on where the dollars should be going out in the future. As the council recommended, we're addressing immediate needs while also keeping some of the CARES Act funding on hand for future needs that may arise as we continue to respond to COVID-19 and keep our communities safe. As part of our support for businesses in the immediate, we're also working on and finalizing details for financing options that will make a substantial difference in keeping business operations moving, with a focus on those businesses that may not be eligible for the existing grant programs. Once those details are finalized, additional tools will be added to the current handful of coronavirus relief funds programs, and we anticipate that this will be happening in the relatively near future. Before I open up for questions, I wanted to provide an update on the new cases we saw yesterday, as well as where we are with testing. Yesterday, there were 8 cases reported from Gaudin County. It's my understanding that the county held a press conference just shortly before mine with an update as well. Investigations into those cases are certainly ongoing, but it does appear that many of the recent cases are associated with one another. Well, a small handful have no apparent yet exposure identified, yet the epidemiologists and those working in contact tracing are working on it even as we speak. To me, though, this also, it underscores the need for continued testing as we closely monitor the spread of this virus and potential impacts of reopening and the arrival of tourists. Recent efforts to expand testing in Gaudin County as we prepare for tourist season have also identified COVID-positive individuals. To date, we've identified 20 cases this week in Gallatin, Bighorn, and Yellowstone counties. It's important to note that we're finding many of these cases as a result of expanded testing and recent recommendations from the CDC to test all close contacts. Until recently, when we were doing that contact tracing, only symptomatic contacts were tested. But as we recognize the role of asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic infections in transmission, and with broader testing availability, we'll continue to test more. Meaning, so with that contact tracing, once we find a positive case, we're actually endeavoring, local public health is, to test everyone that positive transmission might have had contact with. As a result, we will find more cases and be able to conduct contact tracing and other control measures to limit the risk to others. We're continuing to work toward reaching our testing targets. As you well know, in past few weeks, efforts have been focused on setting up testing for nursing homes and tribal communities. We've reached out to all the long-term care facilities in our state and provided supplies or support where it's been needed. Of those participating, over half of the long-term care facilities have completed testing, with approximately 1,800 individuals tested and no positives found. The remainder have begun testing or are working through the process of doing so, or being contacted to ensure that ultimately every long-term care facility does the testing. We're also continuing to work with our assisted living facilities all across the state. It's about 216 of them. So far, about 80% of them have agreed to test. And we're working out those both with the individual facilities, at times with community health centers that will be undertaking the tests in there. So far, 8 facilities have completed their testing in total, approximately 104 tested, and again, no positives found. Many facilities are performing the tests themselves, and then where they cannot, we'll be providing support. Blackfeet, Fort Belknap, Crow, Fort Peck, Little Shell, and the Chippewa Cree tribes have all completed a first round of community testing events. Through those large-scale events, approximately 5,300 individuals have been tested, with positive cases identified so far just in the one community. We've been working closely with Bighorn County and the Crow Nation to identify those at risk and offer testing. The result has been the identification of many new cases that otherwise may have gone undetected. Next week, the Northern Cheyenne Tribe is setting up drive-through testing. The week thereafter, CSKT will be doing so. And we're continuing to work with our tribal nations on plans for then continuing these testing events. Furthermore, the Department of Corrections is in the process of conducting surveillance testing at facilities, has received results back so far on 240 tests at 4 of those facilities so far, all negative. Thus far, that's been Montana Correctional Enterprises, Montana's Women's Prison, Riverside Special Needs Unit, and Core Civic. Surveillance testing at all Department of Corrections facilities and most contracted facilities is anticipated to be completed and test results back by June 12th. Starting next week, we'll also be expanding further the avenues for Montanans to receive COVID-19 testing. It includes testing in tourism communities. Thus far, we've been working with the communities of Red Lodge, Livingston, Gardner, Whitefish, and West Yellowstone through initial discussions on testing approaches, particularly for frontline workers, to begin next week. Community health centers are also starting to hit the ground running so that every patient that enters the center could be offered a test. And that's the same with our emergency rooms and select dental clinics across our state. As we keep moving forward and making increased testing available both in targeted areas and more broadly for the general public, symptomatic or asymptomatic, we'll continue to work with local public health, businesses, and facilities to accomplish our goal of enhanced testing as a means to keep the virus mitigated in Montana. Been really appreciative of how Montanans and tribal members have stepped up to make sure that those that want to test, we can get access for them. Look forward to those continued partnerships throughout the state in response to this pandemic. I'll now open it up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can press 5*. You'll be notified that your hand is raised. When we unmute your phone, you'll be notified that you've been called on to ask your question. First question, please.
Yeah, Governor, this is Troy Schwartzman from the Montana Radio Company.
Hi, Troy.
Hi. Here pretty recently, there was a proposal issued, it was a joint proposal, as I understand, by the Montana Outfitters and Guides Association and FWP, and they were looking at issuing additional non-resident licenses to folks that had applied through an outfitter, didn't get it. The idea is just to bring more people into the state who are spending money. You passed on that proposal, and I was wondering if you would comment on just why you did that, if there's any thought toward helping that industry down the road.
Well, certainly, and we are working, for one, reopening on June 1st to try to get so there's no longer a 2-week quarantine for out-of-state visitors is one of the things that we had heard time and time again for not just tourism, but outfitters to be able to plan for the summer. And we'll continue to work with all businesses as we go forward and take a look at any proposals that might come up.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question. Is there one on the phone? Please. Hello?
Sorry, hi. Hello?
Yep, you're on.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is Kiana Gardner with the Daily Analyst in California. You said that about 80% of the assisted living facilities have completed tests thus far. For those who haven't agreed, are you able to elaborate on maybe some reasons behind that?
So part of it is just really actually working with, I mean, there are 260 facilities, roughly 260 facilities across the state. And part of it's an educational, 216, I'm sorry, assisted living facilities. Part of it is educational, us working with them, suggesting here's why you should do it. And you know, there isn't anything that would certainly require them to do, but for the safety of both their workers and the individual residents, certainly think it's a good idea. And part of it's an education process and going back and forth, and part of it's making sure that we have the health infrastructure. By the end of this, I hope that all of our long-term care facilities and all of our assisted living facilities do test both all of the residents and their workers. Please.
Governor Bullock, John Riley, MTN News. As I understand it, asymptomatic testing is going to be beginning here in Lewis and Clark County this weekend and the following weekend. Is that testing part of larger statewide testing? And if so, where are the other areas where that's going to be happening?
So we've been working with each local community health center like Peerview here and saying that we want to do two things. One of which is we want to make sure that there's access for individuals that might want to test to get one. So that's what that drive-through testing is that, you know, we think that it's been a long 3 months. There was at one point an absolute shortage of tests. And then it was only testing if you had come into contact with an individual who was positive and you had symptoms. And it had now gotten to the point that certainly if you even have one COVID symptom, we encourage you to get tested. But we also want to make it much more available for everyone that might have any concern. So part of that's through the drive-through testing that, as you noted, will start this weekend here in Helena. And don't want to just limit it to that, though, because we also, if we're really going to have a good understanding of what this virus is doing on the ground, want to do what we can to make sure it's not just self-selected, meaning that I might have a concern, so I'll get tested, but others won't. So we're working with the community health centers, as well as emergency rooms, as well as many dentists, to get a greater cross-section of individuals. It'd be great if you'd offer a test to anyone that walks in. Directly to your point or question, though, Great Falls has run a number of drive-throughs. Shelby has. There's been some discussion in Yellowstone and Missoula counties as well. So we're working with our public health partners to try to get that accessibility and availability out all across our state.
And then just a quick follow-up. Would you suggest to anybody who is asymptomatic to get tested to just get a better understanding of the community?
Well, I think that if anyone has any concerns, certainly that they should. You know, that, look, we also have to recognize, though, I mean, one of the things that, and the concern about just opening it up for testing from a public health perspective is, so you go through and you're tested and the test comes back negative and you think, all right, game over. This is great. I can get back to my regular life. I mean, all that test does is gives you that snapshot of a moment of knowing that you're COVID COVID-19 not COVID-19 positive. So I certainly encourage people to get tested, but I also encourage them to recognize, A, it's a snapshot in time, and B, that doesn't mean that we should relax any of the other things that Montanans have done to date to really take this seriously. The social distancing, the washing our hands, the wearing a mask in public places where social distancing isn't possible. Next phone question.
Hi, Governor Holly. How are you?
I'm good, Holly. How are you?
Good. I'm wondering about, you talked a little bit about holding back some of that $1.25 billion from the CARES Act we got. I'm wondering, are you still looking to see if some of that money might be able to go toward offsetting revenue losses, or are there discussions you're hearing about another package from Congress that might be able to put money toward that? And then, I don't know if Director Livers is there, but I'm wondering if he has any more information on updated revenue estimates, or if he could talk about maybe how quickly after the July tax deadline you think we might have a better picture of income tax revenue.
Sure, Holly. I'll turn over to Director Livers in a moment, but two things. Yeah, so there has been some discussion about a subsequent legislative package that would either allow some of the CARES Act $1 to address both local government and state government revenue losses. There's also been, as we know, the proposals that are put out saying that a new round of funding will be available to address state and local government losses. And we haven't seen any more movement, other than what I've read and what we talk, as far as the governors talk about on the phone, that this could happen any time in the upcoming weeks. But also part of holding that money back and not getting it out the door all initially is to see both what the continuing needs in businesses and communities are. So it doesn't just directly relate to either your local or state governments. And as far as revenue projections and things, I think, yep, Director Livers is right behind me.
Thanks, Governor. Thanks, Holly. Yeah, we continue to monitor the situation. We don't have specific updates at this point, but we are watching as different data become available and different forecasts from those data. We'll most notably be looking at the new information as Legislative Fiscal Division prepares its revenue forecast update later this month. And with respect to how quickly we'll know income tax data after the July deadline, I would hope that within a couple of weeks we'll have a pretty good sense of what the actual income tax picture looks like.
And I'd also add that just as this has been, a dynamic time and rapidly changing in many respects too, though, that we're also seeing some real good things happening. I mean, we're already 23,000 Montanans have returned to work since sort of the peak of unemployment. If you count part-time, 28,000. So we're also seeing more and more folks getting back to work, and it's good to see. The next phone question.
Hi, Governor. This is Corin Kate Carney with Montana Public Radio. Can you hear me?
Sure can, Corin.
Hi. I'm wondering if the state is going to be doing any kind of increased inspection tracking of the funds that are going out and how businesses and local governments might be using them to offset COVID-19 costs or losses. Wondering if the state potentially could be liable for money that's misspent, and if that would create any need for increased auditing.
So Corin, so what we're doing is we pull out the money from as we're rolling the money out to both counties and cities and towns, is we're reimbursing expenses as opposed to just writing them a check at this point, because directly to that, yeah, the money does go through the state And it's the obligation of the state of Montana to ensure that that money's actually used consistent with the CARES Act. So the programs,
Collecting receipts on those?
what's that?
Is it daily collecting receipts on those expenses?
Go ahead. Director Louders.
Thanks, Governor. Yeah, on the local government expenses, we will be collecting both invoices and receipts to verify work done and money spent.
Thank you.
Jessica Watts with KPAX-TV. You mentioned when you announced that you were going to do more testing that we should see more cases. So obviously, is the more testing kind of the result of this spike in cases? And are you kind of shocked to see more of these cases coming out?
So I'm not shocked to see more cases in as much as that even when we went into phase one, it said, we've got to understand that this virus is with us and will be with us for a long time. So what we as Montanans need to do is both take it seriously, but then the quicker that we can identify cases, an individual case, we're more likely, with the work on the ground through contact tracing and testing and quarantine, to make it so that that one case doesn't become a community spread. With the additional testing that we've been doing, like Bighorn County's an excellent example, that we did end up, just through that greater community testing, identify positive cases. And I think that as we amp up testing more and more, we could see more and more. And that's something that certainly should be a reminder to all Montanans that we still have to take this seriously. Just because it's warm and summer and, we're all have the cabin fever, we still have to take sort of the public health side of this seriously. Yet also recognize, though, that additional testing, we will be identifying more cases. People that might not have gotten tested that were either symptomatic or asymptomatic.
And just another question. There are rumors of several extremist groups coming here to protest this weekend and next weekend. So kind of what are your thoughts on those, and are you worried about seeing some more spikes in cases from those protests?
Yeah, and first and foremost, any time that people gather, I certainly have concerns that we could see positive transmission. That's the same with graduation parties and everything else. But I think from the perspective of, look, the right to peacefully demonstrate, it's enshrined in our Constitution. I hope that those that are out demonstrating are recognizing some of the public health concerns, wearing a mask, and taking steps like that as well. Next phone question.
Hi, Governor Bullock. This is Freddie Bonatis, Buzzard Chronicle.
Hey, Freddie.
Hey, I'm not sure if you said this or not, but I want to know how much money was available for local governments to get reimbursed for costs related to the virus, and if there was a maximum a county or a city can receive. And I also kind of wanted to know what's changed to allow tests for everyone who's been in contact with an infected person to automatically get tested.
All right, I'll answer the second part of it, then I'll turn it over to the budget director. So what's changed is a couple of things, Freddie. One of which is, we've gone through in 3 months where there was an absolute scarcity of tests at times and testing supplies, to the point where it's not like it still doesn't occupy part of my day and my team's day to make sure that we have the ample testing supplies, but we're not living in that scarcity like we were. So that's trying to encourage the greater testing is, I think, one of the ways that we can be open, stay open, and identify cases early. Secondarily, also, the Center for Disease Control also had gone from, and in part it might be reflected from the difference from the scarcity of supplies, of saying now that anybody that's been in contact with a positive should be tested as well. So it's both CDC guidelines and it's it's the ability for us, and as we're aggressively trying to get more testing out there, just to make sure that we have both an understanding of what the virus is doing in our state and also the ability to quickly identify, isolate, and contact trace any new positives. To your first question, I will turn over to Director Livers.
Thank you. With respect to the amount of money going to local governments, at this point, we're standing up a program to reimburse all eligible expenses for costs incurred as a result of responding to the pandemic. It's pretty speculative right now to know exactly how big that number is going to be. We've been working with our partners at the League of Cities and Towns and the Association of Counties to identify a list of, kind of an evolving list of eligible expenses. And since they work on the same fiscal year we do, at the closing out their year the end of this month, we wanted to get one round in quickly, so if they did want those to go on their books this year, we could get the reimbursement there and or get the expenses booked at least, and cover some of their first costs from the pandemic. And but they did ask if they could circle back and have another submittal in July as well, just given the fact that fiscal year ends a busy time for everybody. So we'll have 2 rounds of reimbursement here in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and I think that'll start giving us a pretty good picture of what kind of expenses we can expect for local governments.
Other questions? Next phone question.
Hi, this is Nikki Willett from Yellowstone Public Radio. Thanks so much for holding this press conference today.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks. This is kind of alluded to the rallies planned across the state regarding the death of George Floyd. Some are expected to draw quite a few people. I've got 3 questions. One is, what kind of law enforcement and public health presence do you think should be at those events? 2, do you support deploying the National Guard to protest if they don't remain peaceful? And 3, is Montana sending or has it already sent National Guard members to protest outside of the state?
So the first question was, what law enforcement and public health do I think should be sort of looking over these any protests that occur? And I mean, I think that that's firmly within local law enforcement. And I trust our local law enforcement to work with their community leaders and the protesters as far as what might be necessary. And from, just as we had protesters even around our state capitol, actually protesting my directive, saying that we should be open even faster, is but another example. I think that local law enforcement worked with the protesters and made some of those determinations. Your second question was it should the National Guard be involved, or would the National Guard be involved?
Would you deploy them if the protests become violent or destructive of property?
I'd have to have conversations with certainly the local community leaders in that. I mean, look, we need to allow people to peacefully demonstrate, and there's a lot to demonstrate about. But I think that you can actually do that in a peaceful way which doesn't destroy property. And haven't had conversations about deploying any National Guard now. And I'm asking the protesters, I'm asking those who are raising their voice to do it in a way that actually can help preserve our communities as well. And I think your third question was sending National Guard to other states. I haven't had, so typically how the National Guard would be deployed to other states is it would be through an EMAC process. It's a mutual aid process where another governor would call on me and say, here's our need, would you consider providing National Guard soldiers or airmen along the way? We have not received any formal request to date, so there haven't been any. If asked by another governor, I'd certainly take a look at it and consider it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Next question. Go ahead, Eric. Yep.
Great. I just wanted to ask about the status of county level testing data. I think somebody had mentioned Monday that there might be some of that coming in by the end of the week.
I don't know where we are on that. What's that? Yeah, Eric, apologies. We're still working on it, and hopefully then by the end of the week.
Great, thank you.
Next question. Is that it?
Hi, Governor Bullock. This is Marisa from NBC, Montana. Two questions. One, President Trump has threatened to use the military to counter protests. Is there a jurisdictional issue there? Could you call that off if it gets to that point, or would it be out of your hands? And back to COVID, I think we have 15 or 16 new cases now in Lewis and Clark County. Do the numbers line up with what you've been anticipating? And is there a threshold if they get to a certain point that you might scale these phases back?
So, Marissa, to your first question, could the president actually call up the federal military, and could I do something about that in the state of Montana? I have grave concerns if the president actually invoked the Insurrection Act and called up the federal military. And just so to be clear, that the president would have to invoke what's called the Insurrection Act to be able to use the federal military, like the Army, domestically. And look, I'm not the only one that has grave concerns about that. I mean, I think you saw Secretary Esper yesterday say that probably doesn't think that that's a real good idea. When it comes to managing the crises or the unique circumstances of what's happening in our states, it really should be up to governors to determine what best fits their state's unique circumstances. And governors have been leaders throughout this global pandemic, and will be leaders through this crisis as well. And your second question was, as you see additional cases, I mean, is it what I expected, and would there be thresholds or tipping points where all of a sudden we had to dial back some of the reopening? I did expect to see additional cases, both as we opened up some and as we've deployed additional testing. And by and large so far, especially when we can isolate exactly where these new positive cases came from, and then do the contact tracing and testing along, that's working exactly as it should. Where I would have much greater concern is if we got back to a point where we had widespread community spread. So meaning that COVID-19 is substantially more cases in a community, and we can't identify where those cases are coming from.
So is there a threshold that you guys are watching for, or waiting and seeing what happens?
Well, we haven't had any community spread in quite some time, like literally months. So from that perspective, there isn't any magic number of this is the new clusters that could cause problems. And we'll be constantly and consistently working with both my health crew and our local public health as we identify that. But there is no community spread anywhere in Montana right now. Next question. Oh, we got them all? Well, I will thank you all again for joining. Also, just continue to watch out for one another. Treat all of our Montanans and those who will visit us as family, meaning be careful, practice appropriate hygiene and social distancing where appropriate, celebrate all across this state, our 2020 high school graduates, there are many graduations happening all across the state this weekend, but do so also with recognition that the actions that we as Montanans take will help continue to guide exactly the future of COVID-19 in our state. So thanks so much.